All right, so in our last segment here, we're going to deal with two things. The value system first, that pretty much goes with the rise of industrial capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. An example of the many ways in which the Industrial Revolution changed all of American society, and that's certainly true. The second part of this will be about Gilded Age politics. We've already looked at politics at the local level, city government, the machine systems. But we'll take a quick look at politics at the national level as well. We'll see why when we get there we're giving it less attention than the business side of the Gilded Age. But a little bit of attention to, before we move on, to how wrenching these changes were. The Industrial Revolution, the industrial capitalism, and by wrenching I don't necessarily mean all bad. I think there's good and bad in here, but changes they were, and revolutionary changes they were. Right? Industrial Revolution, the word is used for a reason. It's commonly believed, I think it's a correct belief on the part of scholars, that when societies move from old-fashioned small-town agricultural societies, like the U.S. is doing here, to a modern high-tech urban industrial society, that it's not just the economy that changes, the way goods are produced and distributed, we've already seen that, but it changes everything. It changes the value system, it changes politics, it changes a family life, it changes everything. And we'll just pick out one thing here, and we'll see how it changed Americans' values with regard to economic life, with regard to how to what your viewpoint should be with regard to money, a job, your place in the socioeconomic hierarchy. So we start with self-help and social Darwinism. They're related. I would say that this is my own idea. I don't know if anyone else ever said this, but I kind of think of self-help as a softer version of social Darwinism. So it's kind of like they're saying the same thing, but one's a soft version of it and one's a really hardcore version of it. We've already seen the self-help philosophy, and in a sense predates industrial capitalism, so it's not entirely true to say that industrial capitalism in the Industrial Revolution changed the value system about money and how we're supposed to look at the economy, from something else to self-help. But it certainly was a useful value system kind of laying at hand for industrial capitalism, and there's no doubt that it got pushed and believed and written about, talked about by influential scholars and writers and politicians. William Graham Sumner, the great Yale sociologist, below, one of those, although he was a social Darwinist, so the more extreme version. But we've seen self-help in a couple of places. Let's just pick one. Booker T. Washington, the African-American leader who, remember, focused and wanted African Americans to focus on economic success first, before making efforts to achieve civil rights through protest and that kind of thing. He wasn't saying never to protest. He was just saying we should do it in the right order. We should work on economic success first. And also remember that Booker T. Washington believed in self-help and did that himself. All right, so he walked to a college that he wasn't even admitted to, miles and miles and miles way away from his home he'd heard about, and just kept at the president until they could let him in and started taking classes and got a degree. So Washington believed in the doctrine of self-help, which only grows in the Gilded Age, which says, what does that mean? You help yourself? Well, okay, yeah, that's part of it. But it sort of means that you're supposed to help yourself, and you're not supposed to really expect others to help you, whether it be government or you're supposed to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, the kind of common way of saying it, at least in the past. And this is better for you. That's the belief anyway. that if you don't sort of do it yourself, you don't sort of have incentive to work hard, you don't develop the right habits, so it's better if you help yourself. Booker T. Washington believed it. If W.E.B. Du Bois did not, and a growing number of Americans believe that here. Social Darwinism is, again, stronger variant because what it's saying is that the world is a brutal struggle to survive, right? Taken from Darwinian theory. Darwin wasn't a social Darwinist. Nonetheless, his ideas made this somewhat, I think, likely, even if he didn't, accept it. But it was the idea that just like animals compete, to survive in the wild, that human beings do the same thing. But Darwin, of course, was talking about over long, long periods of time, and Sumner's talking about people competing in an economy in short amounts of time, weeks, months, years, which isn't what Darwin was doing. But he is saying there's a similarity. The competition is the same, and it's unavoidably ruthless and extremely difficult. And I think the key to this, it's a clever argument, by the way. I'm not saying Sumner was trying to, pass something off on us, fool us, because I think he really believed it. But it is a clever argument because it's sort of saying nature. I think nature is the key word here if you want to understand social Darwinism, even though it's not in the title, in the phrase. It's sort of like Sumner, another social Darwinist, Herbert Spencer being the guy in England that usually sort of gets the credit for being the main intellectual force behind social Darwinism. That nature, if you look at it in the animal kingdom, let's pick out a lion. Say lions, if a lion is chasing down a gazelle, what do lions eat? Gazelle, I don't know what else. Close enough. So a lion's chasing a gazelle. Right? You sometimes see those things on TV shows where there's a pack of gazelle or whatever it is, and the cat, whether it's a lion or whatever else, zeroes in on one poor thing, and there's kind of like this serpentine sort of chase going on, and the lion cat finally overtakes it, and I look away. Oh no, I don't want to see that. Poor thing. And we tend to feel sorry as human beings. Naturally, we tend to feel sorry for the kind of weaker, more vulnerable creature there. But of course, we don't get mad at the cat or the lion because we know the cat can't do anything else, and it can't. Right? It's doing what only thing it's programmed in its genetic structure to do to survive, and that's hunt animals. Right? Find prey. And it's kind of a gruesome death either way. If the cat or cats go long enough, unsuccessfully hunting prey, they'll die of starvation, slow, drawn-out death. So it isn't easy, on either side in nature. But we don't get mad at the cat because we know it's sort of baked into its, genes. We don't, say, Mr. Lion, could you please become a vegetarian? Those poor gazelle. That's pretty cruel what you're doing to them. That isn't fair. Right? A lion can't change the way it does something. And so this is the cleverness in social Darwinism. A guy like Sumner, I don't know if he ever said this as the example, I'm sure he didn't, but it's as if he's saying, look, just like it's natural, right? Nothing you can do about it because it's part of nature. For a lion to chase down a gazelle and eat it, it's natural for John D. Rockefeller to drive all of his competitors out of business. Nothing you can do about it. Might not always be pretty. You want to look away, but it's the way the world works. There's nothing you could or should do about it. So it's a hardcore version, social Darwinism, of the self-help doctrine. At its most extreme, it was against any kind of government subsidies for the poor, any kind of government programs to help people in need, because it believed that it not only got in the way of incentive to work hard and sort of do better, but believed that it actually just propped up kind of a useless part of the population. There's a great deal of prejudice in that belief because it's assuming that poor people are useless. But it's sort of like, again, the social Darwinists are saying, look, if the government takes care of the people at the bottom, then they just survive and mate with other people at the bottom and have kids, and then they sort of stay at the bottom, and we have to then take care of them in the next generation. And the government will just go on and on doing this. If we don't take care of them, they'll get weeded out of the gene pool, right? And the gene pool will improve over time, naturally. The word nature or natural kind of comes back in. So that's social Darwinism kind of to its logical extreme, and at its most extreme, they're saying just let sort of things happen as they do, right? Right to pursuit of happiness, he said, is nothing but a license to maintain the struggle for existence. Wow. So it is pretty harsh. Another example of not just the self-help value system in action, but sort of how it gets transmitted and communicated to the larger culture and society are the famous rags to riches stories of one Horatio Alger. You see some of the titles there. I don't know why that's in gray. It should be in white. I think you can read them anyway. There are works of fiction, sort of junk fiction, but he became a fabulously wealthy and successful best-selling author. But all of them are pretty much the same story or type of story, rags to riches. So they're fictional, but it's always a young man who comes from a poor background, and usually he meets an older man that's successful, that kind of sees something in a kid, takes him under his wing, gives him advice about investing or this and that, and the kid sort of is impressed and imitates the guy and starts doing the right things, saving his money, working hard. He wasn't before. He was kind of doing the wrong things, and he becomes this then fabulous success story because he's works, he saves his money, and he doesn't go out and party and gamble his money away. He saves it, and on and on and on. And so the moral of the story was sort of the self-help one. If you want to succeed, do the right things and you'll succeed. And if you don't succeed, it's probably because you didn't do the right thing, so it's your fault. So in the self-help philosophy, there's also the idea that if you succeed, it's because of you. If you don't succeed, it's because of you, which I don't think, of course, is always true either way in society. There are almost always other factors, but there is some truth to this. Our own, any of us, our own place in life and what we achieve and we don't has something to do with us. But this philosophy, the self-help philosophy, in this case, in this vehicle, transmitting it to the country, to millions who read these things, is saying that that's the only thing. That self-help, it's all about you. There's nowhere else to look if you want to succeed, or if you want to explain or figure out why you didn't succeed. Look in the mirror. So the main point with this is it's one of the main ways that the self-help philosophy was communicated, transmitted, spread to society, because these were, again, such widely dispersed, best-selling stories. Another example of this in the same direction were the McGuffey Readers, which had a huge influence on American culture. These were readers for kids, school kids at different levels, first grade through fifth, sixth, seventh, so different levels of learning and reading for different ages. But it did socialize children more or less, the books socialize them to more or less accept the status quo, which means accept society the way it is. So in the Gilded Age, that would mean accept the fact that John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie are super, super rich and you're poor. Just just it's the way it's supposed to be. So it's similar to what we've been talking about. These are all examples of a philosophy that's growing, and it becomes sort of the underpinning value system of industrial capitalism during the Gilded Age and even beyond. Rebecca Edwards, who I've quoted already, said boys read Horatio Alger's stories about urchins who worked their way up from rags to riches, and young men studied success manuals called Pushing to the Front and The Way to Win. Crowds flocked to hear Baptist minister Russell Conwell give his famous Acres of Diamonds speech, which he supposedly delivered 5,000 times. There's not a poor person in the U.S. Who was not made poor by his own shortcomings, Conwell said in Acres of Diamonds. So those are other ways in which more or less the same idea was spread. That the self-help was the way to go. If you succeed, applaud yourself. If you don't succeed, don't point the finger at someone else. Look in the mirror. So whether true or not true, this was kind of the dominant value system of the time. But not everybody bought into this. This guy certainly didn't, and his name was Thorstein Veblen. Interesting name. He was of Scandinavian descent, not an immigrant, but of Scandinavian descent. An economist by trade, a brilliant one. In those days, even if you were an economist or a sociologist, there wasn't so much specialization yet that a lot of intellectuals kind of crossed over fields. So they might be mainly an economist, but they'd also do history and sociology and other things as well. And Veblen kind of fits in that category. So in some ways, he's a social thinker, not just a strict economist. But he did coin some phrases that are still in the lexicon of economic thought even today, the most famous of them being conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption, you may have heard of it, but this is conspicuous means like obvious, right? Blatant, right out in front. Consumption means to consume, right? And in economics, it means to like buy products and be part of the consumer economy. So what's conspicuous consumption? It's buying consumer goods, not because you need them, but because you're trying to show them to everybody. Conspicuous. You're going to show them off. And why do you do that? You're trying to impress them. Why are you doing that? Because human beings seem to have this innate need for status. We're all trying to kind of show ourselves and everyone else kind of where we fit sort of along everybody else, how we stack up next to our neighbors, keeping up with the Joneses. So this was actually a challenge, a major departure from neoclassical economic theory, which was the mainstream of economic thought at the time. So this is a big-name economist who's writing some controversial stuff. Why is it a departure? Because neoclassical economic theory held that people make decisions, at least overwhelmingly, through rational calculation of their economic and overall self-interest. And conspicuous consumption, if that's true, if people at least some of the time buy things for status reasons, that's not rational calculation of your economic well-being, right? You're buying a Mercedes not because you need it, or there's no justification for it at all, except that you want to impress, your next door neighbors and sort of think you're better than them. That's not rational calculation of self-interest, at least not in the traditional sense of the phrase. So Veblen was somewhat controversial. It was controversial in other ways too that we won't get into. Love the haircut, by the way. But the book where that theory first comes out is The Theory of the Leisure Class, and Veblen was interested in something that was going on in the Gilded Age. He was writing and working during this period, so he was a witness to the Gilded Age as well as studying it. But he didn't understand why. This is his belief, by the way. I'm not saying this was true or not true. He believed this. He could have been right, but he thought, I don't understand capitalist societies like the United States. It's so obvious that the rich, like 1 or 2%, are like smashing everybody else in the face with their boot. The other 98 or 99%, and the other 98 or 99% have the power of numbers, and they don't do anything about it. They just, it's almost like they're saying, yes, could you kick me in the face with your boot again, Mr. Rockefeller? Okay, could you do it again, please? Why do they put up with it when it's so obviously unjust? And they have the numbers to do something about it, at the polls or however they do it. So he couldn't understand this for a long time. But eventually he came to understand it. He thought he figured out why it happened. And first of all, I wouldn't necessarily agree with his analysis in what I've presented so far here. Again, it's his view. He could have been right. But what comes next, I think he does make a pretty good case for. And what he says is that the reason that people don't get as angry with the major capitalists as they could. And by the way, there were some. We'll talk about the labor movement in the following unit. We've already looked at it a little bit in the cities. So there was some backlash against capitalists and big corporations already, but he thought it was surprisingly little until he figured it out, or thought he did. He says that what's happening is that instead of everyone, the majority getting together and say, hey, we got to work together to get rid of these a-holes, or at least try to take their power away from them in some way, getting the government to regulate them, whatever it is that helps us in our ongoing competition with them. But people don't do that because our system, like the Horatio Alger stories, the McGuffey Readers, encourage people to believe that they can become the next John D. Rockefeller. So instead of working to sort of take down John D. Rockefeller and guys like him, they're convinced after reading 9 Horatio Alger stories that I can be the next John Rockefeller. I can be one of those in the top 1%, and I can be the one that kicks people in the face with the heel of the boot, and not have to take it any longer. So his belief was that it's the reason there's not more upheaval against the great inequality of the time. And what he is talking about is inequality. The Gilded Age, didn't say this heretofore, but the Gilded Age is known correctly for a gigantic inequality between rich and poor, which I didn't say explicitly until just now, but we should already be aware from this previous units that was the case. Gilded Age Politics. I'll give this fairly short shrift, and we can see why from the first quote from Richard Hofstadter, one of America's greatest historians ever, now deceased, but in the middle of the 20th century, he was one of the big names. And he said in one of his books, American Political Tradition, there's no other period in the nation's history when politics seems so completely dwarfed by economic changes, none in which the life of the country rests so completely in the hands of the industrial entrepreneur. The industrialists of the Gilded Age were men of heroic audacity and magnificent exploitative talents, aggressive, rapacious, domineering, shrewd, energetic, insatiable. From them, the era took its tone and color. He's saying the reason we talk way more about the businessmen than the presidents and the other politicians of the Gilded Age is the businessmen were more talented. They were much more larger than life figures. Rourke says for the politicians, none left a significant, deeply influential mark on the era that altered American history in a major way. They are largely forgotten because so little was expected of them, and they delivered on so little. Although I would say, in fairness to the presidents and other, politicians at the national level in Washington, D.C., that the philosophy of government at the time was a traditional one, which said that the government isn't supposed to do too much. It was very much a limited government theory. The theory is still around, but our government has gotten much bigger and really isn't practicing limited government any longer, and it's controversial for that reason. Some people are fine with it and think it's a good thing. Some think, no, we need to get back to sort of our more traditional roots where government isn't so powerful, isn't so strong. And so part of the reason the Gilded Age politicians weren't more aggressive and assertive is because that was kind of what was expected under the Constitution and in the political system. But it is, I think, certainly true that the talent, is advantage capitalists. You don't have politicians on the level of Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, in terms of their smarts, in terms of their personalities, their ability to sort of get what they want. Not until Theodore Roosevelt, who becomes president just at the end of the Gilded Age. Then things change. Now the politicians have a personality to match the business folks. You might be surprised by this, but as far back as the Gilded Age, and actually even before, election campaigns were very much about ripping the other side, the opponent. They called mudslinging in those days. So negative campaigns, you bet, all over the place. They would dig up anything they could, true or not true, to discredit the opponent, make them look bad. In the election of 1884, which pitted James G. Blaine, Speaker of the House, you see in the middle bottom there, he's the guy who had the victory dinner after his nomination at Delmonico's restaurant in New York City. And in the upper right, his Democratic opponent, nominated as a Democratic candidate, Grover Cleveland. Cleveland being the only president in U.S. history to serve 2 terms non-consecutively, meaning he won here in 1884, served 4 years. He lost his bid for re-election, so sat out for 4 years, and then ran again and won the next time. So he had a break of 4 years between his 2 presidencies. No one else has ever done that. That's what he's most famous for, by the way, which shows again that Gilded Age presidents didn't make that much of a mark. That's what he's most famous for. But I like this. This was a very dirty, sort of negative campaign, but the little rhymes that became famous because of it are my favorite part of it. So in the middle of the campaign, it was found out that Grover Cleveland, earlier in his political career, had fathered a child out of wedlock, which in those days was a big deal in a way that it's not today. But the Republicans ran with that, made up a little rhyme that the voters could easily remember, which said, "Ma, ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House, ha ha ha." And you see the political cartoon on the left there, trying to discredit Cleveland. In fairness, what they didn't point out was that Cleveland, though it was true, he had been taking care of the child financially ever since. And this was before there was any legal way to get a deadbeat dad to pay money. He was doing so voluntarily, so that part didn't get played up by the Republicans. In the middle of the campaign, or from the beginning of the campaign in this case, the Democrats and Cleveland's campaign advisors just kept thumping Blaine again and again for his long-term reputation for corruption in office. So this wasn't anything new, but they're just sort of playing on a familiar chord. Speaker of the House, he was thought to be, probably accurately, corrupt. And so the Democrats had their own little rhyme: Blaine, Blaine, James G. Blaine, the continental liar from the state of Maine. So just openly calling him a liar. That doesn't quite compete with our politics right now, but it does compete with politics fairly recently in terms of sort of its dirty features, at least at election time. The major political issues of the Gilded Age: political reform, we see, the machine system, and the spoil system. We didn't talk about this. It sort of, in a sense, the machine system at the national level, people getting positions and jobs, federal jobs, based on who they know and political favors and that kind of thing, not their qualifications. This was first chipped away at, reform, with the Pendleton Act of 1883, which was the first time. It didn't apply to all government agencies, actually just a small number at the federal level at first, but it was a starting point for something that continued to grow. and eventually moved down to the state level as well, and that is the civil service exam. So the Pennsylvania Act established civil service exams for some federal jobs. It didn't, of course, get rid of, people who had political connections or knew somebody, got the job for the wrong reasons, but it was a start because at least part of the hiring process now is based on how well you did on the examination. What was your score? It was harder to, if you had to run it by other people and you weren't the only one that made the decision about a hiring decision, it was not impossible. It was harder to get your colleagues to accept it if the person that you were trying to get into the job did terrible on the examination, which now was mandatory. Regulation of railroads and trusts was a big issue. Some Supreme Court cases like Munn v. Illinois, which had to do with farmers being gouged by middlemen. The Interstate Commerce Commission that came in 1887, America's first regulatory agency ever. And interstate commerce mainly meant railroads. So this is a watchdog agency to watch over the actions of railroads, at least supposedly, on behalf of consumers. The Sherman Anti-trust Act, 1890, reacting against Standard Oil and other companies' use of the trust mechanism to achieve monopoly conditions. And this was controversial as well. The money question, how much money should be in circulation and based on what or any standard, gold, silver, or no, metallic backing standard whatsoever. Those are the major issues of the Gilded Age. The Interstate Commerce Commission, again, first federal regulatory agency, mainly regulating the railroads, at least at that point. It proved more important as a precedent than effective as a watchdog, Professor Rourke tells us, which is more or less true. So it was a start, at least for those who believe that regulation of corporations and businesses is necessary. I do to a degree, though I'm a bit moderate on the question. But this wasn't too effective, but it established kind of a precedent. Sherman Anti-trust Act was the first legislation ever that worked at sort of breaking up what were considered unfair monopolies. Unfair if it was violating the basic capitalist principle of competition. If it's not competitive, it's not supposed to be acceptable in capitalism. But the Antitrust Act, bearing this guy's, John Sherman's name, the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, general, we've talked about already, it didn't have much teeth to it. So it was also kind of a precedent for later antitrust actions and laws. Sherman actually said of his own bill, it has his name to it because he brought it to the floor, "I voted for it, but the day it became law, I was ready to repeal it." What? It's your name on there, dude. So that doesn't say a lot, I think, for the legislation and what it might achieve. Although within a couple of decades, it did start to be acted on in ways that sort of had an impact. But this took time. Munn v. Illinois, famous Supreme Court case, which came down to really kind of this question. Can a business charge whatever it wants, wherever it wants, whenever it wants? Not necessarily by old-fashioned American thinking. And the Supreme Court heard this case, of course, on appeal from a lawsuit in Illinois. Ira Munn ran the largest grain storage and elevator facility in the state of Illinois. Farmers had to pay a middleman. The railroads are middlemen. The storage facility owners are middlemen. Farmers, to get their corn or wheat to market, have to take it to one of these places and use these special elevators to put it in the train cars and then pay the fees, freight rates on the cars. So this is a middleman expense. And all across the country, grain elevator owners, business owners, and railroads were constantly gouging farmers, jacking up their rates whenever they thought farmers could afford it. And farmers began to complain. And in Illinois, a lawsuit got all the way sort of into the court system, and on appeal got all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And of course, Ira Munn, I'm sorry, I missed a key part of this. Illinois, its state legislature, its lawmakers at the state level passed a law saying that in our state, in Illinois, it's now illegal for grain storage companies to charge more than this much. I forget what the number was for storage of a farmer's crops. So it put a cap on it. And a number of the businesses went ballistic, and Munn, being the biggest grain storage facility business in Illinois, filed suit. And of course, he's going to and did argue that that's violates sort of the American way. It violates my freedom. We have property rights in this country. The government doesn't get to set the prices I charge. So this is a free country. It's a capitalist system, free enterprise. It's not the province of government to do that. So on appeal, Munn wasn't happy with what Illinois did, and so he appealed to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court took up the case and decided 7-2 against Munn, which might surprise you. Chief Justice Morrison Waite, writing for the majority of 7-2, asserted that the popular prerogatives of democracy trumped the property rights of capitalism. So what the court said is, yes, it is a capitalist country. When all things being equal, most of the time you do have the right as a businessman to charge your own prices and your own rates, but not if and when your prices have a negative effect on the community, on the larger society. If it has a negative impact on a majority of the society, then you don't have the right to, and a state government, Illinois, has a perfect right to step in and stop you from doing something that's harming the public interests, the farmers in this case in Illinois. So a somewhat surprising decision. Towards the end of the Gilded Age comes a decision about a different issue, but in a sense it sort of moved in the opposite direction from what Munn v. Illinois had done in 1877. And I think also shows there are other court cases that fit in this track as well. But it sort of shows that in 1877, the value system in the country, even among Supreme Court justices, who are usually elites, was still kind of the old-fashioned small town, small business mentality, suspicious of businesses that are getting too big for the britches and doing too much. By 1895, it appears that thinking had changed considerably, and there's now much more of a comfort with the big business, big corporations sort of getting what they want. U.S. Versus E.C. Knight means it's the U.S. government, the Attorney General's office, filing suit against this company. E.C. Knight refined not oil but sugar. This is the Sugar Trust. It was one of many companies that had sort of come together in a trust agreement, and so this was sort of antitrust action. So the Supreme Court, in its infinite wisdom, decided it didn't deny that E.C. Knight was a monopoly or even a trust. What it said was that the Sherman Act, which had just been passed 5 years before, which we just talked about, didn't allow the court to find E.C. Knight in fault of anything because, and I'll read from Edwards' book again, the court ruled that the Sherman Act gave the federal government no authority over manufacturing, even if the sugar refinery in question belonged to the American Sugar Refining Company, which it did, which controlled 98% of the national market in sugar. So they went to the wording of the Sherman Act, and it says that trusts in interstate commerce are illegal. And so what splitting hairs, this is, in my opinion, a real decision showing splitting of hairs, faulty, questionable legal reasoning by justices of the Supreme Court, to put it mildly, because what they're saying is, well, it's kind of like they're saying, well, we'd love to break up this monopoly, but unfortunately we can't, because we can only break up monopolies in interstate commerce. That's what it says in the Sherman Act. That's the law, and this isn't a case of interstate commerce. Sugar refining is manufacturing. They're manufacturing the sugar in a plant, in a mill, in a factory, so we can't break it up. It's pretty specious, I think, and obviously so, because that sugar has to get into American homes across the country. If American Sugar Refining Company does 98% of the sugar refining, that sugar is going far and wide. It's going pretty much everywhere. So it's interstate commerce the second it leaves the factory, the second it leaves the refinery. As soon as it comes out the door, it's on its way to becoming interstate commerce, far and wide. So they're making a very strange distinction. So we can't do it because it was manufacturing, even though once it came out the door, it surely was and is interstate commerce. That's right. The only way I could figure, by their reasoning, that they could ever break up a trust or monopoly, based on the Sherman Act, is if the product being made, say the sugar being refined, was actually being refined while it was on the train, on the way to California to go to supermarkets or grocery stores. Because then it would be interstate commerce, while it's being made. Although they might still say, well, sorry, it's manufacturing, we can't do anything. This is, to me, a pretty clear example, not the first or last time in history, where Supreme Court justices found a way to make the decision that they already wanted to make, which isn't the way the court is supposed to operate. But these guys are human, and they sometimes have they always have their own views, sometimes strong ideological, political predilections, and this sways their way of thinking about this, and so they make the decision that they want to make, or they make the decision that they think is the right one, even if it's sort of a violation of the Constitution or their constitutional responsibilities. So this was I think a bad decision, and again, specious reasoning, to put it mildly.